Hey everybody, Brian here again. In my previous video on syncing Logic with Dorico, I came across what I thought were the ideal settings in my case to one, get playback from Dorico to sync up to Logic, and two, for the Dorico cursor to also be visually in sync with Logic's audio output. And the way I achieved that was, in this case, say I have a project that in Logic is 140 BPM. I realized that in Dorico, if I shift that BPM marker one bar, so I have one empty bar as I did in Logic, but whereas in Logic, the whole project's at 140, in Dorico, it starts out at 120 and then goes to 140. And you can watch the previous video to see all the details on how I set up Dorico, but real quick, what you do is under Play, VST and MIDI, just make sure you have this TXL timecode loaded. Choose MTC. On the Mac side, choose some IAC driver bus that you have set up, and then choose the frame rate to coincide with the Logic project, and that's it there under VST MIDI. Then under Track Inspector, for just one track, and it doesn't even matter which one it is as far as I can tell, choose that TXL timecode plugin, and then under Dorico Preferences, Play, make sure those IC driver buses are disabled, otherwise you might get some input to output feedback loops and all sorts of craziness. And that resulted in this kind of synchronization. So during that playback, the cursor in Dorico was lining up nicely with when we were hearing the audio output. Everything was working fine. And the way I arrived at those settings was in Logic Pro Project Settings, Sync, setting this to 0, that plays at SMPTE, and then choosing MTC, of course. And then under MIDI, I didn't do anything here. Everything was just default. And that was it. But sometimes there is a pitch kind of glitch using this method. So for instance, if I play back again, we might hear something. So you heard that. It started out in pitch and then it went up. So there's a little bit of weirdness. And it also showed you in that previous video what happens if you don't use this little bit of trickery with the BPM and just have that starting at 140 right from the beginning. And what happened in that case was this. And you might not notice this, but trust me, in this case, the Dorico cursor is about 1 beat or so ahead of the audio output in Logic. And so that was why I took this approach of making sure I had an empty bar and then the BPM change. But this is very non-ideal, because if I want to start someplace later on in the music where I don't have an empty bar, do you hear that? There's all sorts of weirdness going on. That eventually corrects itself, and the playback becomes fine. So those kind of glitches usually happen momentarily for 1 or 2 seconds. But I had a correspondence with TXL. I explained this issue, and so they told me to make some different settings. And what they suggested to do was go under File, Project Settings, Synchronization, where we were, but under Audio, instead of Core Audio Sync Mode being MTC Continuous, they suggested choose MTC Trigger and keep that BPM at the beginning, just like Logic. And now I hit play. So now having made these settings, here's what I get. So it was glitch free. Let me try that again, because usually if there will be glitches, they'll show up within maybe playing it 4 or 5 times. And I'll try one more time. So this approach seems to be getting rid of the pitch glitches, and TXL thought that indeed would be the result of that setting. But I want to play this further so you see what does happen. So I'll play a little bit towards where I have some audio come in, where I have recorded guitar. Start, say, from here. So it might not be obvious to you, but because I'm so familiar with this piece, obviously, I can tell that the audio is out of sync with the MIDI in Logic. And the other thing too, if I go back to the beginning, hit play. I see that the cursor in Dorico is about 1 or 2 beats ahead of the output, the audio output in Logic. So even though this method corrects those pitch glitches, I still don't like the fact that the cursor is off. I mean, that's not a huge deal, by the way, but it's just something that kind of annoys me a bit. So the way I figured out to solve that problem, as well as to ensure that the audio in MIDI playback and sync in Logic, was I go into the Logic Pro settings, under Audio, General, and I'm going to change this plugin latency compensation to Audio and Software Instrument Tracks. So that's just one change I've made compared to the playback that I just did moments ago. So I'm going to go prior to where this recorded guitar comes in. So now the cursor in Dorico is lined up with the audio output in Logic. The audio and MIDI in Logic are in sync among themselves, and we don't have the pitch glitch. So this seems to be an alternative setting that might be a little more desirable. The only thing is, I'm not thrilled about this whole idea of having to disable plugin compensation, at least disabling it on buses and the master output. Because when you're on the Logic side doing your production, you probably have reasons to have compensation by default with all. So with this kind of workflow, you might have to make mental reminders to yourself that for listening purposes in Dorico, you set it that way, and when you're back in Logic doing your production work, you change it back, which isn't a huge deal. You can get used to that. Just something I wanted to point out. By the way, this method also seems to work well when we have tempo changes. So in Dorico, say at bar 11, change it to 160 beats per minute, and then have it go back down, say at bar 19. Likewise in Logic, so bar 11 up to 160, 19 back down to 140, and I'll just play it from the beginning. So there's a change. And everything's in sync. And then I went back down to 140. And back in sync. And so, in summary, the current settings that I'm using on the project settings, synchronization, everything here is default, except remember in Logic, that default is 1. We changed that to 0. We chose MTC. I chose frame rate 25 because in the Dorico TXL plugin, I had that set to 25. I don't think this makes a difference. I've tried it with and without checked off. Same with this. They don't seem to affect anything. In MIDI, everything was just like before. In audio, instead of MTC continuous, I chose trigger. And by the way, I've experimented with these other ones, and they produce all sorts of glitches. And then in Logic settings, under audio, general, this is what we're doing with plugin latency compensation. So hopefully now we're arriving one step closer to having really excellent synchronization in Logic. So there you have it. If anybody does their own experimenting and comes up with some better settings, then please say something about that in the comments. Till next time.